Okay, so you guys sent in some really interesting material for us this time around. Um,
Yeah, this is good.
yeah, it's an article that is really digging into Jason Hickel's book "Less is More"
Hmm.
and this idea of like degrowth and
Yeah, sort of unpacking that.
yeah. So it's a deep dive for our deep dive,
Yes.
um, and we really want to understand like how this degrowth thing is being presented in the article,
Right.
and then really get into like, okay, how realistic is this? Like, how achievable is this? How sustainable would this be in our current economic system?
Yeah.
Which, I mean, we can sort of just, for everyone's benefit, say that the system that we operate in is based on private ownership and this pursuit of profit and free markets.
Capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. So how does this degrowth idea, you know,
Yeah, how does it fit in?
yeah, how does it
Yeah.
fit into that?
I like this article too because it gives a good summary of Hickel's thinking, but then it also gives like a critique of it,
Yeah,
which is perfect for us. You know what I mean? So we're going to see right away there's this tension between this appealing vision of a society that, prioritizes well-being
right,
over just, economic growth
right,
constantly.
right,
Um, and then the challenges of, stepping off of this, economic engine that's built on that growth.
right. Yeah, yeah.
You know?
So we have to figure out how to. I guess the first thing is like, what is this degrowth all about?
Yeah.
So it seems like, as the article lays it out, is not about like some kind of societal meltdown or going back to the Stone Age or something.
Yeah.
It's the idea that we can actually like thrive, and maybe even better.
Thrive better.
Yeah, without this constant upward climb of economic growth as it's traditionally measured.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing here is that what we're aiming for fundamentally changes.
Yeah.
With this degrowth model, or at least with Hickel's vision of it as presented here,
Right.
it wants us to reorient our focus away from these traditional barometers.
Right.
Like GDP and constantly expanding markets
Wow.
towards something more fundamental like human well-being.
Right.
And the article is emphasizing that this shift in focus is actually like the bedrock
Right.
of his argument for long-term sustainability,
I see.
putting people and the planet ahead of these purely economic indicators.
Okay, so it's sort of like the focus becomes more about like quality of life as opposed to just purely economic output.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then the article immediately sort of throws this question at us like, okay,
Yeah.
changing the rules, is that enough?
Right.
And then it uses this really cool analogy of a game board.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the article makes this crucial point that while, introducing new policies and laws,
Right.
which are essentially, changing the rules of the game,
Right.
that might not be enough if the underlying game board itself,
Okay.
which it identifies as market capitalism,
Right.
remains fundamentally the same.
Right.
And the argument here is that, like, the inherent logic and the driving forces of the system
Right.
could end up undermining even the most, well-intentioned reforms.
Okay, so this is reminding me of like if you were to try to play like a cooperative version of Monopoly.
Yeah.
You can change some rules about like landing on properties or whatever.
Right.
But the fundamental goal of that game is still about accumulating wealth and driving other people into bankruptcy.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And
So is that kind of
yeah, that's what the article is getting at.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
without addressing those like foundational principles of market trade, things like the constant pressure for efficiency gains the relentless pursuit of profit, the drive for market expansion.
Right.
Even policies designed to encourage degrowth could face some serious resistance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they might not be sustainable in the long run.
Right. I see. Yeah. And this is reminding me of this part of the article where they talk about how we even understand value.
And there's this distinction between exchange value, like something costs in the market,
Right.
versus use value, like how useful something actually is.
This is where it gets really interesting, because the article is saying, Hickel's point that market economics can really warp our sense of value.
Right.
We start to equate price with quality,
Totally. Yeah.
with importance.
Yeah.
I mean, think about like the marketing for luxury goods,
Yeah.
where like a huge price tag
Right.
creates this illusion of superior value, even if like the practical use
Right.
isn't really that different from a much cheaper option.
Right. Right.
You know, and then there's the opposite of that, where things that are freely available,
Right.
like clean air or community bonds,
Right.
they get undervalued.
Yeah.
You know, precisely because they don't have a monetary price.
Right, right. Yeah, it's like it's hard to put a price on some things,
Right.
that are actually really valuable.
Exactly. And then the article, points to this cultural dimension too.
Yeah.
This like societal, almost obsession with wealth and material possessions as markers of success.
Right.
And the article emphasizes this isn't just about individual choices.
Oh,
this
yeah.
is woven into, cultural narratives.
Totally.
And, how we measure status and achievement.
Oh, yeah.
This adds another layer of complexity to, to this whole challenge of moving towards a degrowth model.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like this, it's this underlying thing that we don't even really think about a lot of times.
Right.
It's just sort of baked into
Totally.
the way that we think and operate. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so given all this, then like, what is Hickel actually like proposing in terms of like concrete policies?
Okay, so the article highlights Hickel's, initial policy suggestions as like a step one towards this degrowth.
Okay.
And they include making extended warranties mandatory.
Okay.
Which would give companies a real incentive to build more durable products.
Right, because they'd be on the hook for...
Because they're responsible for repairs.
Yeah, for a longer period.
So much longer.
Right, right.
And then there are right to repair laws.
Oh, yeah?
Which aim to, dismantle this trend of manufacturers making products that are difficult or impossible for you or me.
Right.
Or independent shops to fix.
Right, yeah. So you can actually open it up and fix it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And then finally, the concept of leasing models.
Okay.
Where, companies would retain ownership of products and would be responsible for their long-term maintenance and eventual recycling or reuse.
Okay, so instead of me buying a washing machine,
right,
I would lease it from...
You lease it from...
a Whirlpool or something, yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay, so these all seem like logical ideas.
Right.
But, the article then sort of pushes us to think about, like, okay, what happens when these ideas run up against the realities of, our current economic system?
Yep.
Like, what are the challenges that it brings up?
Okay, so this is where the article's critique really starts to get focused.
Okay.
It's saying that, while these policies sound good, they would likely encounter some serious pushback from the existing, economic system.
Yeah.
For example, if we actually succeed in reducing consumption by making products last longer, that could lead to a contraction in the market for new goods.
Sure.
Right. So businesses that rely on you and me constantly buying new stuff, they might see their sales decline, potentially leading to job losses, maybe even business failures.
Right. And then that sets off this whole chain reaction of problems, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. The article outlines this like cascade of potential effects.
Okay.
Like market contraction leads to layoffs, which then lead to wage cuts, increased unemployment, and then maybe even inflation as the dynamics of supply and demand shift. The article even suggests that governments might need to intervene to counteract these things, with measures like raising minimum wages, maybe providing subsidies to industries that are struggling, or even implementing UBI.
Yeah, universal basic income.
Right.
Yeah, so it's almost like, trying to hold back a flood with sandbags.
Yeah.
Like you plug one hole and another one pops up.
Exactly. And you just got to keep adding more sandbags.
Yeah. Okay.
And the article also introduces this idea of system self-protection.
Okay.
So think of those lobbying efforts, against certain environmental regulations.
Yeah.
That's a form of system self-protection, where, the established interests are pushing back against changes that could impact their profitability.
Right.
And the article suggests that this drive for cyclical consumption, this growth imperative of capitalism, as it calls it, is so deeply ingrained that, these market forces and the political interests that are aligned with them would likely resist anything that really threatens that cycle.
So for me, just like trying to live more sustainably or whatever, like I'm pushing against this much larger...
You're up against a huge...
Yeah, this huge momentum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And that kind of leads into the next thing that the article talks about, which is this like reform and reaction cycle.
Okay.
So can I walk you through how that might look?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So the article outlines a potential vicious cycle.
Okay.
Where implementing degrowth policies.
Okay.
Like mandatory warranties or right to repair leads to a decrease in consumption.
Right.
This causes businesses to, contract.
Right.
Because demand for their stuff is diminishing.
Right.
And then that triggers those negative economic consequences.
Yeah.
Like unemployment, wage reduction,
Right.
public unrest.
Right.
People are feeling the squeeze. And so the government then might feel the pressure to either backtrack on the policies or introduce a whole new wave of regulations and interventions.
Right, just to try to stabilize things.
Just to try and
Yep, put out the fires.
Yeah, put out the fires, exactly.
Yeah, so the idea is that without addressing those fundamental mechanisms of capitalism,
right,
like these individual degrowth policies are ultimately going to fail.
Yeah. That's the core of the critique in this article.
Sure.
It's saying that these types of reforms, while they're valuable in their own right, and maybe even necessary steps, they might be more effective as supplementary tactics rather than the primary solution to these deep-rooted problems like, waste, inequality, ecological damage.
Right, yeah. And that makes me wonder then, if these sort of incremental changes are going to face so much resistance, what's the article saying needs to happen?
Well, it seems like it's hinting at a more fundamental shift away from the core ideas of market economics.
Okay.
And it suggests that to really, align human well-being with those ecological limits and really address these inherent issues like wastefulness and inequality, that we might need to consider more fundamental transformations that go beyond just tweaking policies within the existing framework.
Yeah. So it's like a much bigger...
It's a much bigger conversation.
Yeah, a much bigger lift.
Right.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they bring up this real-world example about France's attempt to outlaw planned obsolescence.
Yes.
I
was just thinking about that. Yeah, France's experience here is like a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Because the intention was good.
Yeah.
To make manufacturers create longer lasting and repairable products.
Right.
But its enforcement has been kind of limited. It's more of a symbolic statement than a real change in how things are made and consumed.
Right. So what were some of the roadblocks there? Was it industry lobbying or lack of resources for enforcement or...
It's hard to say, from the article.
Yeah.
But it seems like a few things might have gotten in the way.
Right. And it makes you wonder, even if we did have, the will to implement these changes, would it even work?
Yeah, it shows how difficult it is to enact and sustain these policies when, the whole system is still ultimately about growth and consumption.
Yeah. So it's there's this tension.
Yes, there is.
Between this idea of, consuming less for the planet, for society, and then the reality of how hard it is to actually do that.
Yeah.
In this current system that we live in.
It's this central tension that the article keeps bringing up.
Yeah.
And the main takeaway for you, the listener, seems to be this.
Okay.
Policies aimed at reducing consumption.
Right.
They're great steps. They can help. But they might not be enough to fix the root causes of our environmental and social problems.
Right.
Without a deeper look at our economic systems.
Yeah, I see.
Maybe a transformation.
Right, yeah.
Of how we do things.
Right. And it makes you think, if these small policy changes are so hard to do, what kind of bigger shifts do we need to be thinking about?
What does that look like?
Yeah.
What does that look like? Yeah.
It really makes you question everything about our economic system.
Everything.
Yeah. It does.
Wow, this is a lot to think about.
Yeah, food for thought.
Yeah, food for thought.
For sure.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we will see you guys next time.
See ya.